Welcome to the Veterinary Financial Podcast, where we discuss financial freedom and professional success. I'm Meredith Jones, a veterinarian and financial planner for vets.
And I'm Joe Warner, also a financial planner for vets.
Today, we are going to talk about student loan advice for 2026 grads. There are some things about 2026 grads that are unique when it comes to student loans. The first thing is we titled this Wait, Don't Consolidate because in the past there were some very good reasons for borrowers who were new grads to consolidate their student loans and really borrowers just in general to consolidate their loans. And so there was in the past the one-time payment count adjustment that was available during the Biden administration. There were reasons to consolidate, like taking your older FFEL loans if you graduated a long time ago, like I did, or if you had health professions student loans, in order to make those loans eligible for all of the repayment plans or eligible for forgiveness in general. When it comes to the health professions student loans, there were reasons to consolidate your loans. And it's also something that we recommended to new grads in the past. So tell us a little bit about how the advice is different this year for new grads.
Yeah, and it's actually something that comes up in a lot of the consults that I'm doing, and I'm sure you too, for new grads, where in the past it was beneficial to consolidate and basically force your loans into repayment right away as opposed to waiting out that 6-month grace period. The benefit to that in the past was that you would start gaining credit towards forgiveness. And in most cases, for a lot of vets that we talk to, will have a very low and oftentimes $0 payment for that first year out of vet school. And so that was really helpful to have that grace period end early so they go right into that $0 payment early on. No longer is that the case, though, primarily because of some of the new rules around how consolidation works. And I guess not so much how consolidation works, but if you do consolidate your loans right out of vet school, at this point, it can take some time for that consolidation loan to actually be completed. And so you would run the risk of not having your consolidation loan disbursed until after July of this year, which could restrict you in your repayment options. Meredith, I don't know if you want to talk about kind of what that would look like for some new vets if they were to do that and have a loan disbursed after July of this year.
Yeah, and so the important takeaway from this section of the podcast is going to be, if you are a 2026 grad, you should not consolidate your student loans. So the reason is, so Joe was talking about that 6-month grace period after graduation. You're actually going to want to wait out that 6-month grace period after graduation instead of consolidating your student loans, because if you do consolidate your loans, they will only be eligible for the RAP plan, the new repayment assistance plan, which is a 30-year plan, or the standard plan. Most of our new graduates have access to the new version of IBR, which is a 20-year repayment plan where you can get your loans forgiven after 20 years. And so you don't want to be limited to only a 30-year plan when you could have access to the 20-year version of IBR, which for a lot of new grads is going to be the least expensive way to pay down your student loans over time on track to forgiveness. And also it has for a lot of people, a much lower payment than the RAP plan as well. 2026 grads, they're really graduating into this sort of pivotal time where we've got this brand new law where a lot of new regulations take effect on July 1st, right after they graduate in May. I've been thinking of 2026 grads as special flowers for that reason, because it's like some of the advice that we're talking about actually during this podcast isn't necessarily going to be true for 2027 grads, but it is for 2026 grads, which is pretty interesting. So yeah, it's something where you don't want to lose access to a 20-year version of IBR and be limited to only a 30-year plan.
So yeah, if you're a 2026 grad and you're listening to this podcast, then you are in the right place. And you mentioned a really good point too, where a lot of new grads are eligible for the newer version of IBR. And when you compare the newer version of IBR to potentially the RAP plan, if they did do a consolidation and were limited to just the RAP plan for income driven, that could be a significant difference in not only your monthly payment, but also how much you're going to repay over that time frame of repayment. So the new version of IBR is a 20-year repayment plan. And so if you were to consolidate and not have access to that anymore, then you'll be in repayment if you're going for forgiveness for an additional 10 years under the RAP plan. And that additional 10 years and also having a higher payment could, like I said, really substantially increase how much you might pay over that course of repayment. In some cases, over $200,000 over the lifetime of having those loans. And so I think that's when you look at it from a long-term perspective and not just what the monthly payment is on those two plans, that would be another reason to definitely wait out your grace period, because losing the flexibility of having the IBR plan and having that extra cost of being on RAP for that long of a period of time far outweighs the benefit that you would get of entering repayment a few months earlier if you were to leave the grace period.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the questions that we've gotten, because previously we were able to recommend a strategy so that people could start making progress toward forgiveness or making progress toward, whether they were $0 payments or payments, actually making progress on their loans from the beginning, right after graduation. So some people are asking us questions like, well, hey, is there some other way? So if I can't consolidate, how can I actually make it so that I can choose a repayment plan right now, right after graduation? And the answer is there really isn't another way around that. And so you just need to wait out that 6-month grace period. You will be able to enroll in an income-driven repayment plan and choose a repayment plan, but you're going to need to wait until more like 30 to 60 days prior to the grace period ending. And so this is something where a lot of our new grads are just going to be, 2026 grads are just going to be in kind of a holding pattern over the next few months. Good news is you don't have to make any payments during that time.
And another question that we get a lot too around consolidation is, what if I just did a consolidation for some of my loans? And so, reason that someone could do that is to have access to other repayment options, maybe for like health professions loans or anything like that. But you still would not want to do that, because if you were to even just do a consolidation loan that included maybe a small portion of the loans that you have, the repayment plans are going to be limited for all of your loans to the RAP plan if it's disbursed after July 1. So it's not just going to apply to the new consolidation loan or new loans that are taken out in general after July 1st. Any loan taken after July 1st, whether it's a new loan or a consolidation loan, will affect the plans available for all the loans that you have as a borrower.
Yeah, and it's just the way that the rules are written. So the rules, the way that they are written, they say any loan that is disbursed after July 1st. And so that's if you went back to school and borrowed money. That is if you consolidated, because a consolidation loan is considered to be a new loan. And so that's why it's like you wouldn't be able to just consolidate a portion of the loans. And so unfortunately, those folks who do have the health professions loans, the recommendation for this year is going to be to just pay those loans off rather than consolidating and getting them wrapped up in with the direct loans. And so that's another way that 2026 grads are relatively unique, because we might not be giving that advice again, but for this year, we absolutely should.
Yeah, and I think for veterinarians that are graduating after 2026, if you have loans disbursed after, that date anyway, then you're likely going to be limited to just having the RAP or the tiered standard repayment plans as options for repayment. And so the recommendation as far as like consolidating things like that may change in the future if you're already limited to just that. But again, that would only apply for graduates after 2026, not for the class of 2026. And so I think that's one of the things that unfortunately can be a little bit hectic with student loans, is it does change year to year sometimes, which is why every situation is very unique. And so I think that's why it's always helpful to talk, one-on-one with a loan professional. But I did just want to point out too that could change in the future for vets that are already limited to just RAP. But for now, for 2026 grads, definitely the recommendation would be not to consolidate.
Yeah, and like Joe was saying, the difference between being limited to the RAP plan and having a 30-year timeline versus being on IBR and having a 20-year timeline, that can be a difference of like $200,000 long term that you would be paying extra. So it can be a really big difference. I would also say, because we've been talking about new IBR a lot, those folks who didn't borrow until after 2014, because that's the majority of new grads are in that boat. But even if you only have access to the old version of IBR, that's the 25-year timeline. So let's say you did have maybe some undergrad loans that were from before July 1st, 2014, and you're in that old IBR category, you still don't want to consolidate because you don't want to lose access to the 25-year plan either. So it's just something that's really important. Let me give you a scenario here. Let's say, okay, it's May as we're recording this, is probably going to come out in June. What if I submit it now, and then I try to strong arm my loan servicer into processing this right away? Like, why would that be a bad idea?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think you really have a lot of power in how quickly your loan processor may actually process that. And even for just switching plans, not even thinking about consolidations, but even just switching plans, most of the borrowers that I'm working with are getting notices that that's going to take longer than what they might have thought, and like just having it done in a week or so. And they're getting notices to be put like into even a forbearance. And so really, as strong as your arm might be, I don't think that unfortunately you would have as much power in actually pushing that through. And so again, I think it just goes back to, it's just not worth the risk with that.
Okay, so to sum up this section then, okay, so if you are a 2026 grad, do not consolidate your loans, wait out the grace period. You cannot get out of the grace period early, sorry. Bright side is that you don't have a payment. Other questions that we have been getting, because really, I think at this point at least, consolidation is going to be something that even if you are not a 2026 grad, you're also not going to want to do it, because you would also be limited to the 30-year RAP plan. There's a scenario that pops up once in a while, Joe. And it will be something like someone will say, oh my gosh, I had no idea that I had health professions loans. So this could happen to a 2025 graduate, because those loans are actually, they have a 1-year grace period. And so I often will see that, and somebody will say, oh, I didn't know I had these loans, and so I never consolidated. Well, at this point, you would also not want to consolidate as well. So it applies to everybody, at least at this moment in time, is you want to have the most options available to you for payment plans. You don't want to consolidate because it's going to limit your options moving forward.
I think that's a great example with like the health professions loans, but also, like you had said earlier, for those borrowers that maybe have, whether it's undergrad loans or some other loans that were prior to July of 2014, and you're an old IBR eligible borrower, having that extra 5 years of repayment on the RAP plan is going to be like towards the last 5 years of repayment. And those are oftentimes the time in your career where you might be earning the most amount of money. And so your payment is probably going to be higher in those latter years anyway. And so those extra 5 years towards the end of repayment, if you were limited to just the RAP plan, can still be really significant, even if the other option is old IBR. So having those extra 5 years. And I think, there are a lot of things that we could go into, and maybe we will further in another episode around like the RAP plan. But one of the arguments I think is, well, the RAP plan does have an interest subsidy. A lot of times when in that interest subsidy works, where interest would get waived over the payment if there was any unpaid interest each month. And so I think in the cases that I've seen with a lot of the consults I've done between borrowers that are old IBR eligible and RAP eligible, that interest subsidy, if they even are getting the interest subsidy, is still being offset by having that extra 5 years of payments when you look at it in terms of total overall cost towards the borrower when they're in repayment. I don't know, are you seeing kind of the same thing, Meredith?
For most people, but not everybody. And so that's why it's important to, whether you're using a student loan calculator or whether you book a student loan consult with us, it's important to actually run the numbers for you specifically, because we do have some scenarios where it would make sense to be on the RAP plan. And so we would need to take a close look at the numbers, especially if you are in that old IBR versus RAP category, to see what is going to be best for you long term. Yeah, and then I was also looking at, as far as why we said, okay, with 2026 grads, this might be the only time that we say don't consolidate. The reason for that is because let's think ahead a year. So let's think about 2027 graduates. Most of those students are going to need to borrow student loans for their 4th year of vet school. And so they would already have borrowed loans after July 2026 in that case. So assuming that someone is in that category where they would need to borrow for all 4 years, they would already only have access to the RAP plan or the standard plan anyway, because they had to borrow after July 2026. So that's why this advice that we're giving for 2026 grads, this might be the only year where it's a big deal as far as that consolidation advice goes.
Yeah. Something I was just thinking about too is that advice isn't necessarily about not choosing RAP. It's more about just making sure you have the flexibility to choose the plan that's best for you. Because even if you don't consolidate, that way you remain having eligibility for some of those other plans like old IBR, new IBR, you still have RAP as an option. It's just you also have those other options too, because you haven't borrowed after July 1st. And so I think it's really important to know that it is something that just gives you additional flexibility in repayment across all your loans, and instead of just limiting it to that repayment option.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, you don't want to close the door to IBR. You want to leave that door open. Okay, so what else do we have for advice for new grads? Next thing I always advise new grads is to file a tax return. So this episode is going to be published after the main due date for 2025 taxes. But I can say that even if we've got some new grads listening who did not file a tax return, well, you've got up until the extension deadline. The tax extension deadline is actually October 15th, where you should be able to still file a tax return. So the reason we recommend filing a tax return is because as a student, you probably didn't make a whole lot the year before you graduated, right? And so this is how people can get a $0 a month payment or a $10 a month payment, is they can say, okay, well, here's my 2025 tax return. And this is something you can do even if you didn't work at all. You can actually file a $0 tax return. You might be able to use the IRS Free File website. There are some other online websites you can go to actually file a federal tax return for free. So that's where I'm usually pointing people to get that tax return filed.
Yeah, that's great advice. And I think too, another thing to think about is you do have time to decide which plan is going to be the best fit for you as well. In terms of kind of timing when to switch the plan or pick the plan, I would always recommend maybe doing that around 45 days or so before your grace period ends. So you do have time to do that. And you may not know which plan you're going to enroll in right now, which is okay as well. Generally, once you know what your job is going to look like after you graduate, and so basically I just mean like in terms of how much your salary is, things like that at that job, then that would be a good time to consider getting a consult or running those numbers, because when you're looking at the different income-driven plans, your income is one of the primary driving factors in how that plan will look like for you specifically. And so you do have time to think about that and a time before you should sign up for a plan. don't panic and think you need to go right now and quick sign up. You definitely have time to think about it, get a consult or talk to somebody or use a calculator like Meredith said to kind of figure out what does work for you 45 days or so before your grace period ends.
Yeah, and certainly it's a high anxiety year to graduate into because of all of the changes in student loans over the last few years. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of new regulations taking effect July 1st, directly after graduation. And so we have seen more folks than usual asking about, okay, I feel like I really need to select a plan right now because borrowers who have been in repayment for a while, a lot of them are having to switch plans and there's all these deadlines. And so we can release the new grads from some of those other deadlines that are coming up and just know that, okay, it's going to be okay to wait out that grace period. And so realistically, if you graduated in May, we're probably looking at September or October with signing up for an income-driven plan.
Also, when you are looking about the different plans as well, be careful which one you do sign up for, because there are some features that we really haven't necessarily seen before in some income-driven plans with the RAP plan. Mainly what I'm talking about is any payments that you do make on the RAP plan will only count towards forgiveness on the RAP plan. And so it doesn't carry over if you were to do the RAP plan right away for, let's say, 5 years and then switch to IBR. And all 5 years that you were repaying on RAP would not count towards forgiveness on other income-driven plans like IBR. And so that's another really strong consideration to think about. I would only consider RAP if you were 100% confident that that was the best long-term plan for you. And yeah, I just think that's something that's a little bit different with some of these new loan rules. And so I think that's worth talking about when you are looking at the different plans.
Yeah, and that is a conversation that has come up with some other student loan consultants because for a while we didn't know what the final rules were going to be with the RAP plan. But from my point of view, yeah, I think Joe's point of view as well, now that we know that that final rule means that the payments on the RAP plan don't count toward IBR if someone were to switch to IBR later, I think it's going to be more important than ever to know what plan is going to work best for you long term so that you can go ahead and get into that plan to begin with.
Yeah, and that is kind of a one-way path too. So if you do enroll in IBR and then switch to RAP later, those IBR payments will still count towards forgiveness under RAP. It just goes the other way where RAP doesn't count towards IBR. And I know it can be tempting a lot of times to just go and find whatever plan does have the lowest payment and then just sign up for that one and ride that one out. But there are some things you need to think about long-term as well of which would be the best plan. And so like we kind of talked about a little bit earlier where there are cases for borrowers that are old IBR eligible and they're comparing that with RAP. And RAP might have a lower payment, but is a 5-year longer repayment time frame. And so the overall cost may be a lot more than what you would pay if you were just on IBR. And so I think thinking about the long-term payment and not just picking, the plan that has the lowest payment right away, if you're going for forgiveness, then that's a good idea to think long-term.
Yeah, and I mean, it depends on the situation, right? Because there are some cases where that interest subsidy could potentially outweigh the fact that they're paying for 5 more years. But I think we've seen a lot of scenarios where that has not been the case. So it's really important to run your numbers and make sure that the plan that you're choosing is tailored to your specific situation. I want to give a shout out to our public service loan forgiveness folks and folks who are going into nonprofit or academia and folks who expect that they're going to stay in a role like that for 10 years or more. For those folks, it may make sense to just choose the lowest payment, but this is a new grad episode. And so since this is a new grad episode, gosh, it's going to be really hard to be confident that you're going to be in a public service role for 10 years because a lot can change. A lot of people change their mind about what type of practice they want to do or work in a year or 3 years or 10 years after graduation. And so it's something where I think it's going to be a little bit harder to just, even in some cases, to just use the conventional advice of going for public service loan forgiveness, just choose the lowest payment because of those payments on RAP not actually counting toward IBR.
Yeah. And I know this is a really popular saying, but I think I heard it first from you, Meredith, where my crystal ball is in the shop. And so, so I definitely know, like, I think that applies here because, like Meredith said, like, we have no idea what everything looks like 5 years, 7 years, 10 years from now. So yeah, I think, having flexibility and going towards the path of flexibility could be the best option a lot of times. And so I think that's particularly relevant for new grads as well. As you get into your career and you figure out kind of what you enjoy about vet med and kind of tailor your career around that, your plan may change. And so having flexibility around that, I think, is super important.
Absolutely. So if you are a 2026 grad, don't consolidate your loans, file a tax return. Yes, even if you didn't work, and also even if your parents claim you as a dependent, you can file a tax return. And you'll want to make sure that you actually run your numbers so that you sign up for the plan that's going to work best for you long term. So that's going to be really important to take a look at. If you want help thinking through your options based on your specific situation, you can schedule a student loan consult with us. To do that, go to calendly.com/vetdebtexperts, and we're always happy to help. And until next time, take care and continue your path to financial success. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered individualized financial advice. If a specific investment is mentioned, it should not be considered a recommendation or endorsement to buy or sell the investment. All investments involve risk. Past performance does not guarantee future results. You are encouraged to seek the advice of a financial professional before implementing any investment strategies discussed. Yay, compliance.